Hello and welcome to the webinar Top Trends in Sustainable Innovation, reviewing key developments of 2021 and predictions for the future. My name is Chris Robinson, Research Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'll also be presenting today alongside my colleagues Cole McCollum, Analyst, Harini Venkataraman, Analyst, and Krista Marshall, Analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all of the questions we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll make sure to respond. So this is always a fun time of year at Lux. We're reviewing all of the key writings and things that happen in the industries that we cover over the last year, thinking about all the exciting kind of analysis and things we want to work on the next year. And one of the really fun parts of that is putting together reports which look at what are the key developments in those industries? Did some of the predictions we made last year come true or not? And make new ones about what we expect to see in the future. So today we're going to review a handful of those that are more focused on sustainability. So to start things off, I think it's worth asking the question, what exactly is sustainability? I think in a lot of ways this word is a bit ambiguous to start with, but it's also lost its meaning as many marketing terms have used this term liberally, right? And not always in the appropriate context. So it's worth level setting on how we define sustainability. And we've adopted, what the UN defines sustainability as, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's a very broad definition. And as such, there are really so many ways in which companies were impacted by sustainability initiatives over the last year. We can look at, bans around plastics. There's certainly more awareness about removing plastics from the ecosystem. Most notably in France, they looked at, introducing a ban on single-use plastics for many common food items and individually packaged food items. In the energy space, we actually saw energy companies across the oil and gas value chain in both Europe and North America feeling pressure to change. And that pressure is coming from investors, activists, and it's impacted many companies, forcing them to address their emissions challenge and develop plans for reducing emissions in the future faster than maybe they would have otherwise. In the agriculture space, there's been growing recognition of the need to address things like methane emissions from the agriculture sector, which come from livestock emissions. In the US, again, we've seen the Biden administration announce measures to work with the USDA on limiting emissions from the ag space. We saw a more kind of dramatic approach from Netherlands aiming to reduce livestock population by roughly a third as part of their goals. And finally, I think all of this came to a head at COP26, the global climate summit where really all countries come together, share the plans that they're working on to reduce emissions, and ultimately make sure we're getting close to reaching our global emissions reduction goals and embracing sustainability. So these are all examples of how sustainability is impacting companies and the spaces we work in, but it's also very diverse. And that's why at Lux, we came up with the Lux Sustainable Innovation Model. Really, this is a way to categorize different innovations as how they pertain to sustainability. And this is what we'll focus on today. So for each one of these sections, circular tech, future consumer tech, climate tech, and digital tech, we're going to share a little bit about a prediction we made last year and understand did it come true or not, as well as review another key event that happened over the last year, and also make a prediction about what we expect to see in 2022 and beyond. So to kick things off, I'll invite Kristen Marshall to talk a little bit about circular technologies.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. So when it comes to our circular tech pillar, this includes all technologies enabling the transition from a linear make, take, dispose economy to a more circular economy, with some of the core principles being elimination of waste, as well as extending the lifespan of materials and products. As you see, there are a good number of technologies we cover here, and this list, by the way, is in no means exhaustive. This is because there are a wide range of approaches for driving a more circular economy, from the raw materials being used, to how products and packaging are designed, to how they are disposed of and processed at end of life. Now, adopting and scaling up many of these technologies would not be feasible without the help of external factors such as policy. In fact, policies such as China National Sword essentially where it closed its doors off to the world in terms of its plastic waste, these have been instrumental in getting the rest of the world to think more deeply about waste in the first place. So the ripple effect of this has been many nations around the world passing policy to enable building up recycling infrastructure within their own borders, and even mandating that certain packaging and products contain recycling minimums. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it brings us to one of our first predictions from last year, and that specifically had to do with recycling policy in the United States. So unlike other nations we've seen in Europe, South America, and in other parts of the world, our prediction was that in the US would lag behind those other regions given its mismatch of municipal, local, and state regulation combined with its lack of federal laws. While this is more or less still true in 2021, there have been some really interesting developments that I'd like to highlight. The first is that Maine and Oregon both passed their own extended producer responsibility, or EPR, for packaging legislation into law. Now, extended producer responsibility schemes make corporations and manufacturers more responsible for the end of life outcome for the products and packaging that they put onto the marketplace. These laws are intended to, reduce plastic usage, incentivize the use of recyclable materials, and also provide the funding that's needed for new technology as well as infrastructure. Now, in the specific case of Maine and Oregon, producers will help to pay a fee based on the amount and type of packaging that they put into these states. Now, while this may not seem significant, 6 other states have introduced similar EPR bills, including California and New York. And now California and New York alone are big enough markets to make an impact on producers' bottom lines and rethink the materials they're using in their packaging. And then backers of these policies are also trying to shop it off in other state capitals as well. And in addition to state level activity, a federal bill, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, was also introduced last year that could bring EPR into every state. However, there are still some looming challenges with this bill ahead, especially in an election period that's being clouded by inflation. It's also interesting and important to note that some of these policies include task forces to study and evaluate misleading or confusing claims about whether certain products are indeed recyclable. And this brings me to a more unexpected event from this year out of California. While California didn't pass an EPR bill per se, it did pass several other recycling and composting bills, one of which has to do with labeling packaging using the recycling arrow symbol. Now, California is restricting the use of this symbol and other recycling symbols to products that have a high likeliness of actually being recycled. So this move is actually going to hold brands more accountable to not only making products that are quote unquote recyclable, made from materials that hypothetically could be recycled, but it's also binding them to making sure that those products indeed get recycled at the end of the day. And so what I think this is going to do is I think this is going to have a very big impact on brands that have made very public commitments for making their packaging 100% reusable, recyclable, and renewable by 2025. Now, lastly, for the circular tech pillar, in terms of our 2022 prediction, there's been a lot of emphasis on the recycling aspect of the circular economy. But moving into 2022, I'm expecting to see a lot more emphasis being placed on curbing consumption altogether, whether it's be reuse, refurbishment, or even resale. I know the circular economy is full of R's. We've already seen this trend start to emerge. For example, resale for the apparel market has been exploding, with the market segment growing 25% fast, or 25 times faster than traditional retail. And it's actually projected to double the size of fast fashion industry by 2030. And then there are on-sale resale platforms like Poshmark and ThredUp that are both valued at over $1 billion. So in 2022, I expect that we're going to see, the rise in digital resale marketplaces with more involvement from large brands, and then for other types of goods as well. So not being limited just to apparel. I also think that there's going to be a lot of development in terms of products, how we're making products, to be made to last. So, one example I come across recently was a stocking company that's actually producing their stockings from a material they claim is 10 times stronger than steel. So I know that this example is kind of funny, but I expect other brands to be putting a lot more time and investment into product design to enable business models that really, decouple growth from pure volume sales. So with that, I'm going to actually pass the baton to my colleague Karini to talk about the future consumer pillar.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for those great insights. Now, future consumer tech is one of those three key pillars of our sustainable innovation model. And specifically, this pillar is really looking into enabling technologies for sustainable innovation while keeping up with evolving consumers' preferences. You could think about the intersection of several social drivers and regional demands, making all the more challenging in terms of navigating the CPG industry, I would say. And it requires a very thoughtful approach when it comes to technology innovation. 2021 has been a very eventful year for us here in the agri-food and CPG industry, and driven by policy changes and regulations, some of them Chris mentioned before, we really saw a surge in interest when it came to sustainable food production. Today, I'm going to be talking in the next slide about one of the key predictions we made in 2021, the beginning of 2021, which was around the increased momentum in cellular agriculture, especially with greater involvement from corporates. Now, true to our prediction, what happened in 2021 is that the emerging categories like fermentation-derived proteins and cell-based meat, all of this really caters to the broader sustainable food production trend. They really saw a surge in momentum, be it investments, partnerships, or really also new players entering the space. In particular, I would like to highlight the funding momentum in the cell-based meat space, which reached $1 billion mark, which is pretty great for a space which just has been evolving only since the past 3 to 4 years, I would say. 2016, there were like 5 or even 4 startups to start with, and now we are at a stage where there are about 100 startups and a lot more activity going on there. While core agri-food players, including meat processing companies, or agri-food commodity players like Cargill, all of these continue to invest in the space. What's more interesting and notable is really those adjacent players. Think about chemical and material companies like Hanwha Solutions or Mitsubishi Chemical. All of these companies also started investing. And this really shows that the cell-based meat will require the interplay of multiple industries. And we're going to see a lot more of this crossover innovation taking place for this cell-based meat, looking to solve some of these challenges, be it for materials like scaffolding or more on the serum-free media side. And if we go to the next slide, one other notable development, which we did not specifically predict about, we did cover that through the course of the year, but we did not make a specific prediction, is about the involvement of CPG players in the regenerative agriculture space. And we all know that this is a space which is very hot now. And I would say that it was kind of loosely used, the term regenerative agriculture, when it came to what exactly it meant. But in 2021, it did get a little bit more focus by connecting those regenerative agriculture goals to targeted outcomes. Overall, I would say we saw an uptick in carbon markets and as well as nature-based solutions, thinking about biopesticides. And again, regionality plays such an important role for a lot of the adoption of these emerging technologies. CPG players like General Mills, Nestle, Danone, there's a long list. I could even say that all of these companies, be it in the food industry or even in the apparel industry, the CPG players are really looking to pilot some or regenerative agriculture initiatives. And we're going to continue to see these developments in terms of adopting different approaches, especially if you're the first movers in the space. It could be through strengthening your own internal capability or even integrating expertise from external partners, which is going to be crucial to kind of move the space forward, I would say. Now, last but not the least, moving on to 2022, and in the next slide, if I were to make one prediction for 2022, I have a lot on my mind, I would say, but I'm going to bring this from a health and wellness standpoint. And we all know for the future consumer tech pillar, health and wellness is such an important aspect. So this prediction is really revolving around the kind of the growth in functional ingredients for gut health, like probiotics and prebiotics. These will continue to grow in demand. But what's more important, and what I would like to highlight, is the focus will also shift to discovery and production scale up. I think those are two important segments that a lot of players need to think about, especially for discovery. Really think about leveraging technologies like bioinformatics or AI-driven methods to expedite that whole new ingredient discovery process. And we're also going to see on the production front, companies turn to synthetic biology or fermentation to really rapidly scale up some of these new ingredients. We've already seen some players, interesting ones, entering the space, which are not the core health and wellness players, I would say. What this is going to do is really create an opportunity for players with existing capacity or technology know-how to potentially expand into the health ingredient space. A couple of examples that just come right on top of my mind are DSM and Novozymes, which have adopted a similar approach for different use cases. So going into 2022, we're going to see both core agri-food players as well as non-traditional players enter the functional ingredient space, thinking about solving some of these unmet needs here. So with that, I will pass it on to Chris to talk a bit more about our climate tech pillar.
Excellent. And thank you very much, Harini. So when it comes to climate tech, it's a pretty simple description. It's the suite of technologies you can use to reduce emissions, right? And it's not just limited to the energy space, whether it's, agriculture, heavy industry, conventional and gas or utility companies, everyone is focused on reducing emissions. And really these suite of technologies are all aimed at, eliminating or substantially reducing those. So the one prediction we made last year, which I thought would be interesting to talk about, was really how companies are approaching procuring renewable energy as a way to reduce emissions. In 2020, we started to see a lot of oil and gas companies post kind of net zero targets for roughly 2050 or so, looking at scope 1, 2, and kind of some of scope 3 emissions for those organizations. But more broadly, we've seen a lot of companies, increasingly procuring renewable energy. And related to this specific prediction, we did, broadly see evidence that this did happen. We saw a lot of new companies join the Climate Pledge, which is led by Amazon, which is committing to net zero carbon emissions by 2040. And we also continue to see corporate power purchase agreements being signed. And historically, the tech space has been very involved in that signs the majority of power purchase agreements to power things like data center with zero emissions. But increasingly, we've seen industry signing these types of agreements. Shell, BASF, Air Liquide, all in the last year signed pretty significant power purchase agreements to source renewable power. At the same time, I think we did see quite a few companies still relying on things like carbon credits, carbon offsets, which that's not something we can use to fully achieve net zero, so to speak. It is maybe a valuable tool along that path without having to invest in, procuring renewable energy. And thinking about, one event we didn't quite expect, but certainly was impactful is something I touched upon in my introduction, which is the role that, investors, activist investors and activists themselves have really been successful in pushing for major change at oil and gas companies. We saw, in Shell's case, they were actually held liable by a Dutch court for their contributions to climate change as part of what they kind of colloquially call the cellar door kind of law, that you have a responsibility to keep a certain upkeep around, kind of public goods. And really it was found that they had enough of a negative impact on climate change that they were ordered to develop a credible, sufficient strategy to reducing emissions and addressing that impact as well. Similarly, we saw, at Exxon, activist investors successfully pushing the board to develop a decarbonization strategy. Unfortunately, we saw that come out just this week or last week. And ultimately, I think we would have liked to see that include something like scope 3 emissions, but broadly, this trend of investors and activists successfully pushing for major change was absolutely a major factor in the last year. And kind of looking toward what we expect to see in 2022, we have a very specific prediction that I think is indicative of a broader trend in the industry. So we're expecting major system integrators of energy storage systems for the grid to start incorporating non-lithium ion based chemistries in their product offerings. Today, lithium ion has been the backbone of grid storage. Costs have fallen dramatically with electric vehicle adoption, pushing that down quite a bit. And it provides a duration of right around 4 hours, which is really well suited for early penetration of renewables. But we also know that the more and more renewable intermittent generation we add to the grid, we also need longer and longer duration storage to be able to store energy for days, hours, or even weeks at a time. And we are now getting to a point in some regions where we're starting to hit that threshold where we need to store energy for more than just 4 hours at a time. And so I do think we'll see system integrators start to get ahead of that curve, start to engage with some of the startup communities that are focused on things like metal air or flow batteries that are well suited toward long durations, and be more active in offering those products. And I think the other kind of extra incentive there is all of the concerns there are around the lithium-ion battery supply chain, and the availability of things like lithium, nickel, cobalt, et cetera, that are really putting pressure on lithium-ion battery prices. And we might even see lithium-ion battery prices increase next year because of the scarcity of those materials. So now I will hand it off to Cole to talk a little bit about digital tech.
Thank you very much, Chris. So lastly, I'd like to talk about the role of digital technologies in sustainability innovation. And we'll review our predictions from last year, as the other pillars did, and highlight what we see coming this year. So digital technologies really serve as this foundational set of technologies that are impacting each of these three pillars of the sustainable innovation model. And this can be done in a number of ways, for example, by utilizing sensors and satellite imaging to collect data on things like emissions, technologies like data wrangling to clean and manage the data, and computing technologies like edge computing or quantum computing for making better predictions and more accurate optimizations. So if we look at our prediction from last year, we really we made a number of predictions, but one prediction was that stakeholders would really start to adopt digital technologies like IoT sensors to enable better data tracking and visibility into logistics and into the supply chain. And we made this prediction for several reasons. The first of which was that the supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic was leading companies to have a push for having better data on where their assets are throughout the supply chain. Likewise, with the rollout of vaccines, we saw a greater need for cold chain monitoring, so that you could have data on properties like temperature, throughout the asset's life cycle. The other reason we expected to see greater adoption of technologies to enable visibility is for sustainability purposes. So companies can use the logistics data they collect to optimize transportation routes, or identify other sources in their supply chain where they can, improve efficiency on multiple levels. And I would say overall, we saw this prediction largely coming true. A recent survey from the satellite company Inmarsat showed that around 90% of transportation and logistics companies either accelerated or plan to accelerate their adoption of IoT in 2021. And I would say, moreover, we saw around $12 billion in funding go to digital startups in the supply chain and logistics space, which was actually more than the previous 2 years combined. And so I think this data point really highlights the traction and adoption that these technologies are gaining. So if we look at another notable event that we saw in 2021, that was perhaps less expected. This was Apple's introduction of its right to repair policy, which enables customers to have access to genuine parts and tools to fix their Apple products themselves. And this was somewhat surprising, as Apple previously had made it quite difficult for customers to get access to new parts, to new genuine parts. And their assembly processes often use components like proprietary screws and lots of glue in the assembly process that made it even more challenging for customers and third-party technicians to repair their devices. But not only, and I would say not only did these previous policies make repairs more expensive, but it did have environmental impacts, as customers would have to go out and buy new phones instead of just simply replacing parts on their old phones, which created or devices, which created more electronic waste in the process. But I think what we really saw last year was that from not only consumer demands, but increasing regulatory pressure on circular economy issues, Apple really had to make this significant reversal from its previous policies. And given Apple's size and its leading position in the consumer device and electronics market, we really expect many other companies to follow suit in the coming years with this change. And as we look towards 2022, our prediction for this year is that we really expect to see more efforts around data sharing and data transparency around sustainability and climate-related data. And I think one thing that the pandemic taught us is that having globally available access to accurate data around things like cases and hospitalizations is critically important to making better decisions on how to navigate a global crisis like the pandemic. And likewise, we expect to see data sharing become as important to managing sustainability efforts, whether it's sharing data around emissions, carbon tracking, conservation data, so on and so forth. And I would say we expect to see more government pressure on large companies to share these data sets. And we also expect to see the growth of new startups that will make use of emerging digital technologies to enable more transparency and data sharing. For example, blockchain can enable data sharing without having to rely on any one company's database, or artificial intelligence techniques like federated learning can be used to make predictions on data without needing to actually release private data sets. So with that, I will turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you, Cole. So I wanted to provide just a few maybe concluding thoughts as we think about really the future of sustainable innovation over the next year or so. And first I want to make the point that we've talked about a combination of technology and regulations today, and that is because really fundamentally technologies are what are enabling the energy transition and enabling sustainability in the circular economy, future consumer technologies as well. But generally the pace of how quickly these things are adopted and make an impact depend on regulations. And certainly technologies can influence regulations, right? We wouldn't have phase outs of combustion bans of internal combustion vehicles if electric vehicles didn't exist today. So understanding both the regulatory environment as well as finding new technology solutions are both important to winning in sustainable innovation. And the second point we'll make is that really the pressure to invest in sustainability is mounting. I touched upon pressure in the energy space, which is coming from regulatory bodies and activist investors, but we can look elsewhere, right? In the CPG space, we're seeing consumers apply that pressure. Everyone's feeling pressure from their supply chain to reduce emissions as well. And that pressure is only going to increase in the future. And finally, both of those first 2 points underscore the urgency for which companies need to act. Developing a plan to reduce emissions, understand how trends in sustainability may force your company industry to change is really critical at this point in time. So with that, we'd like to open it up for questions. So thank you very much, Cole, Harini, and Kristen. I'll invite you guys to come back on screen now for any questions. As a reminder, you can type those in the questions box. If we don't get to your questions in this call, we'll make sure to get in touch after this webinar as well. So I think we have time for maybe one question here. I would say, Kristen, one question for you. For the California law that you cited, what do they mean by plastics actually being, and actually being is in quotes, by the way, recycled?
No, exactly. No, that's a great question. So they have some specifications for what they mean by actually being recycled. So it's actually going to be, you know, the products will have to be, or they're going to have to satisfy recyclability regulations that are issued by CalRecycle, the organization that's responsible for covering all of this. But essentially, they're going to have to be proven to be collected for recycling by recycling programs encompassing at least 60% of the state, and from materials and formats that are routinely used as feedstock for the production of new products or packaging. And then I also think it's interesting that this specific policy also includes some material specifications as well. So, you know, it's in order to qualify as being recyclable, these products cannot contain components or inks or adhesives that are commonly known to prevent recyclability of products. And the law has a few other specifications as well, but that's a great question.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you once again, Cole, Harini, and Kristen. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email later today. Additionally, after leaving this webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey in today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you might have that helps inform and improve future webinars as well. So thank you for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.